I'm Vincent Henry, Professor and Director of the Homeland Security Management Institute at Long Island University Riverhead, a congressionally designated U.S. Department of Homeland Security National Transportation Security Center of Excellence, the only U.S. Department of Homeland Security Center of Excellence to offer graduate degrees in the Homeland Security Management field. Our fully online graduate programs in Homeland Security Management and Cybersecurity Policy are designed and delivered by professionals for professionals. It is my distinct pleasure today to introduce Professor Stanley Sapinski's online video webinar entitled Homeland Security Context and Challenges, the Interdisciplinary Quagmire. Dr. Sapinski is Associate Professor with the Homeland Security Management Institute, teaching a variety of courses and mentoring theses in our fully online graduate programs. A nationally renowned figure in Homeland Security education and one of the founders of Homeland Security as an academic discipline, Stan Sapinski is a recognized thought leader in our field, and he brings a truly unique and multifaceted background to his teaching and his scholarship. He is a wonderful example of the practitioner scholar, and his contributions in both areas are substantial. Stan Sapinski began his long career in the national security sphere as a member of the United States Air Force, where he applied his language abilities and other skills as an operational human intelligence officer in a wide variety of assignments and deployments throughout Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Following his operational career in the human intelligence field, Stan Sapinski applied these abilities and skills as an educator, developing the Daily Knowledge Vitamin, an innovative learning methodology to keep linguists' language skills current that was adopted throughout the Department of Defense. After earning his PhD in Instructional Systems Design from Florida State University, Dr. Sapinski served as Associate Professor of Russian, Director of the Language Learning Center, and Dean of the Faculty Squadron at the U.S. Air Force Academy. Upon his retirement from active duty, Professor Sapinski became the first Deputy for Education and Training of NORAD and the newly created U.S. Northern Command, the Department of Defense's combatant command established in the aftermath of the September 11th terrorist attacks to defend and protect the continental United States and the North American continent. As the Deputy for Education and Training at NORTHCOM, Dr. Sapinski was the founder and the first director of the Homeland Security and Defense Education Consortium. In that capacity, Dr. Sapinski created relationships to facilitate development of Homeland Security education, curriculum, and programs, to establish research priorities in our field, and to forge the academic discipline of Homeland Security. He is widely published in the field and makes frequent professional presentations on a host of Homeland Security and Homeland Security education issues. I am fully confident in stating that no individual has made a greater or more lasting contribution to the development of Homeland Security as an academic discipline than Professor Stan Sapinski, and we are proud to have him as a faculty colleague with the Homeland Security Management Institute. The Homeland Security Management Institute is also proud and honored to host Professor Stanley Sapinski's outstanding video webinar presentation entitled Homeland Security, Context and Challenges, the Interdisciplinary Quagmire. Stan?
Thank you, Dr. Henry, for the introduction. Practitioners and scholars alike agree that all aspects of Homeland Security, from budgeting to planning to operations, are rife with seams or gray areas, where responsibilities and procedures are not perfectly clear. Ambiguity is generally amplified at the most inopportune moments, such as during a crisis, and the result is the carrying out of missions at less than peak efficiency. These seams surface because of how we conduct Homeland Security. For example, should a terrorist act be considered a crime or an act of war and subject to the rules of each? At what point does response to an event take precedence over crime scene issues? The seams also relate to who should conduct an operation. Should primary responsibility be state or local? Does the active component of DoD have jurisdiction, or does the National Guard? Considering the U.S. has written or rewritten more policy and strategy since 9/11 than at any other time in history, conducted a wholesale reorganization of federal entities responsible for Homeland Security, and extensively modified or created national plans and procedures for carrying out preventative and response operations, it is no wonder these friction points, also referred to here as the interdisciplinary quagmire, or IQ, exist. The quagmire is a universally recognized stumbling block to Homeland Security operational effectiveness. This presentation will explore some of the issues that cause interdisciplinary conflict and some actions to take that can minimize it. We will begin by looking at which disciplines are involved in Homeland Security. There are lots of things that make working together difficult or cause interdisciplinary conflict: cultures, procedures, regulations, national strategies, etc. And we will first look at those that stem from strategic and policy levels. Some of these issues will be explored in detail to include whether terrorism should be considered an act of war for the military to handle or a crime to be handled by the law enforcement community. Constitutional issues primarily related to federal versus state powers and authorities, and the use of state National Guard units versus federal Title X military forces. Next, conflicts that occur at the operational and tactical levels will be discussed. Finally, this brief will propose some action and guidance that can reduce deleterious impact on our homeland security and improve collaboration for the long term. Problems arising from the questions of how and who conducts homeland security are amplified by the very nature of the participants and their organizations. With homeland security being such a broad term, who is excluded? Operational and procedural perspectives are as varied as the disciplines involved. In an article published in 2004, Pelfrey cites 31 distinct disciplines that play some role in homeland security, and each comes with cultural, technical, regional, and a variety of other backgrounds and characteristics that challenge cooperation. Many of these are very obvious, such as law enforcement, the military, first responders, governments at all levels, etc. Some, however, are not quite so obvious. For example, major event security and public safety, which includes agencies, organizations, and personnel whose responsibility is the development of security plans and the implementation of those plans for public events, venues, and major events. Public information/media management includes public information officers, their staffs, and the media organizations themselves. Their role in communicating with the public cannot be understated. The legal community and prosecutors. This includes those who help guide decisions based on legal parameters as well as those involved in prosecuting and conducting criminal proceedings. The skilled trades. This includes a broad range of individuals or organizations such as tradesmen and engineers, predominantly in private industry, who may provide their unique skills and expertise for mitigation and response/recovery. This is a sampling of the types of groups or individuals that must work as a team, often in stressful situations, and many of whom have never worked together previously. A good analogy is that it is akin to a pickup game of basketball. Each team member is important, each brings a different set of skills, each is critical to effective overall performance, but they may have never played or practiced together and have to feel out their respective roles and responsibilities. The list of potential causes for interdisciplinary conflict is virtually unlimited. However, these are, in my opinion, the major sources at the strategic level. Are there clear delineations for conducting homeland security when done domestically or when it transcends international borders? Is there such a thing as a home game or an away game? At what point does an event go from local and/or state management to broader federal control? How are authorities impacted by the Constitution? The Department of Homeland Security was stood up specifically to provide a coordinating function for handling counterterrorism in the aftermath of 9/11. However, particularly in light of the fact that FEMA is part of the department and its involvement in the disaster caused by Hurricane Katrina, is Homeland Security all hazards, or does it focus exclusively on terrorism? What are the differences between Homeland Security and Homeland Defense? Does it depend on who's in charge of an event? While each of these terms has specific definitions, there is still broad disagreement throughout our community on exactly what they mean. When military support is required, who will provide it? The active component operating under Title X of U.S. Code, or the National Guard operating under Title 32? What conflicts can arise due to the differences in legal authority of using these entities? And finally, is terrorism a crime or an act of war? Who takes responsibility for countering terrorism clearly depends on how it is defined. Each of these areas is influenced by regulations and laws, definitional differences, and, as previously mentioned, the cultures that each discipline involved brings with it. We will briefly touch on each of these. While we do so, consider how they might affect your specific discipline. So what is terrorism? There are hundreds of definitions. Inconsistency exists even among the agencies that are involved in Homeland Security and perform designated counterterrorism functions. When you ask academics, very few mention criminality. Many of the definitions do include the notion of harm to non-combatants, certainly signifying a military essence. On the other hand, many of the definitions specify unlawful violence. When you look at the USS Cole and the attack on the Pentagon, it is easy to see why terrorist actions can be thought of as acts of war and not simply a criminal activity. A saying among law enforcement personnel involved in Homeland Security is that not every criminal is a terrorist, but every terrorist is a criminal. Examining the definitions of these two side by side, it is clear to see that any terrorist activity is clearly against the law. We should also note that numerous laws have been passed since 9/11 that make associations with terrorist groups a criminal offense. So, pretty easy to distinguish between these two when an act of terror occurs domestically. But when a terrorist act is committed outside the U.S., what is it? We have FBI agents, obviously civilians, in our war zones. What is their role as law enforcement officers? The question is, where do you draw the line, or do we even need to draw a line? And to complicate it even more, can non-state entities start a war? While most Homeland Security practitioners in the U.S. believe it must be a joint effort, the picture painted by the U.S. underscores the military and has emphasized the war. President Bush continuously tied the war in Iraq to the war on terror, which opposes views and experience of European nations with long histories of dealing with terrorism. The European security strategy overwhelmingly emphasizes law enforcement, the judicial system, and intelligence work in a strategy of preventive engagement. The strategy also views the problem with lesser urgency than in the U.S., as it has generally been felt, even after the Madrid and London bombings, that the U.S. is the more likely target. They also generally believe that warfighting antagonizes the nations that produce the terrorists and unduly pit cultures and religions as being the ultimate opponents. To carry this a bit further, was the global war on terrorism an appropriate analogy to use? Why do we use this term? Does the use of the war on terror help rally public support, as perhaps the term did for these other wars? Does the use of the term send a message to our allies and enemies? Most would agree that, indeed, the term war has been used to rally a nation to a national effort, as it did during World War I and World War II. It is meant to provide some focus, support the allocation of resources, and the passing of legislation to conduct action that will achieve an objective. But it can also lead to some confusion and friction when it comes to roles and responsibilities. There are countless examples of non-military involvement and successes in the war on terror and counterterrorism. Many of these successes have come from routine activities. For example, in April 1988, a New Jersey State policeman sensed something was out of place when Yu Kikamura emerged from a wooded area at a highway rest stop. A search of his vehicle revealed enough materials to make 50 bombs. Timothy McVeigh would likely have gotten away with the Oklahoma City bombing if not pulled over by an Oklahoma State police officer for expired license tags. In another example, a persistent Border Patrol officer refused to allow Ahmed Rassam to cross the border due to his suspicious behavior. She found bomb-making materials in his vehicle destined for the Los Angeles airport. And finally, an alert video store clerk turned process videos over to law enforcement personnel after discovering surveillance footage and jihadist-related activity. The work that the civilian community does to support counterterrorism is undeniable. The seams in conflict come when their roles are not clearly delineated and when operating in multidisciplinary environments. President Bush recognized that a team effort was needed when stating in the National Security Strategy for Combating Terrorism that the struggle against international terrorism is different from any other war in our history. We will not triumph solely or even primarily through military might. Civilian and military roles are not clearly separated, and the line between law enforcement and warfighting when conducting counterterrorism is also blurred, thereby adding to the interdisciplinary quagmire. Some rules are clear, that the military will conduct military missions overseas, and that civil authorities will have primacy domestically. This also ties directly into the discussion about the differences between Homeland Security versus Homeland Defense. Arguments have been made that these terms reflect civilian versus military roles or domestic versus foreign activity. Keep in mind the definition of these terms. Homeland Security is an umbrella term which covers numerous activities and agencies. Per the Department of Homeland Security's mission statement, it is a concerted national effort to prevent terrorist attacks within the U.S., reduce America's vulnerability to terrorism, and minimize the damage and recover from attacks that do occur. Homeland Defense, on the other hand, is the protection of U.S. territory, sovereignty, domestic population, and critical infrastructure against external threats and aggression. Some, to include Lieutenant General Steve Blum, the former chief of the National Guard Bureau, argue that the terms are indistinguishable when operating domestically. The distinction between these two are artificial and impractical, but they can be complementary and consistent with operational requirements. Others believe that the term used is dependent on who is the lead federal agency that is handling a disaster at any of its phases. Finally, arguments exist that it depends on whether prevention, meaning activities pre-event, or response and recovery, meaning post-event activities, are being considered. What has served to further the quagmire is the fact that only in the United States is responsibility for prevention and response and recovery combined in a single federal department at the federal level within the Department of Homeland Security. The Constitution is the fundamental document for Homeland Security. It is the ultimate legal authority for how we conduct Homeland Security, but also it is the source for debate and interdisciplinary conflict. The preamble, perhaps the most important portion, designates the people as being responsible for guaranteeing domestic tranquility and providing for the common defense, two critical areas for security. We rely on a complementary application of the instruments of national power, such as the military and economics, for our national security, and the framework for conducting this shared responsibility comes from the Constitution. This, in turn, allows us to establish specific policies and strategies to preserve our values, identify interests, and assure best use of resources to defend our security. And when I say defend security, I mean it in an all-hazard sense. It's not just the military, but what all of us do in terms of prevention, response, and recovery. The Constitution does not establish specific departments or agencies, but they are responsible for creating and sustaining those by legislation. Authorities designated by the legislation have to fall in line with the Constitution. As a result, a wide range of organizations administer public policy, 15 cabinet departments, to include the Department of Homeland Security, 50 state and 4 territorial administrations, and a total of 87,000 plus jurisdictions. The Constitution balances and spreads authorities and responsibilities. James Madison stated succinctly that power in the government is dispersed, divided, decentralized, and limited directly and indirectly by the Constitution. Some of the key articles are: Article 1, Congress has the authority to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts, and to provide for the common defense and general welfare of the U.S. Article 2, there are divided roles in control of the military. The President is the Commander-in-Chief versus Congress, which has the power of the purse. They also differentiate what the responsibilities are between the federal, state, and local levels. One has to wonder, what did our Founding Fathers have in mind? Is it important? It is important to consider some historical context. Our ancestors fiercely opposed a large standing army. They had just seen what it could do with the British, imposing taxes, quartering wherever they wanted. Standing armies were dangerous in 3 ways. Fighting expensive wars overseas imposed great taxes. During war, discretionary power of the executive usually expanded, and the claim by the Federalists was that troops could be used against the citizenry. Thomas Jefferson stated that the biggest threat to the well-being of a people is their own government. The Constitution was the antidote for a potentially too large government, and the Bill of Rights has been considered somewhat of an insurance policy for the government taking away any rights, as well as a system of checks and balances. While these concepts have served us well, these separations of authorities can cause conflict when conducting interdisciplinary operations. Now, one of the constitutional themes is where state authority ends and federal begins. Going back to the preamble, who has the responsibility to ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, and promote the general welfare? Bottom line is that states retain primary responsibility and authority for civil order and protection of citizens. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution does make it very clear that authorities not specifically given to the federal government default to the states, and police power is one of those authorities. Within the spectrum of events that can occur, where responsibilities lie is clear in many types of events. For example, ballistic missile defense is no doubt a federal military responsibility. Many are clear at the other end of the spectrum as well. Dealing with a local disaster, such as a building collapse or small-scale tornado, are local and or state responsibilities. However, as events are scaled to levels beyond local or state capacity, where they cross state borders, or for terrorist events in which there is an international nexus, the lines begin to blur. When looking at the disciplines or the organizations that conduct the duties normally found within that discipline at the local, state, or federal levels, there is significant overlap. The overlap is obvious in many areas, such as law enforcement or the military, but it crosses over virtually every sector of Homeland Security responsibility. Potential conflict of responsibilities comes into existence because of the transnational nature of terrorism. This also reflects the dimension discussed previously. Is it war, clearly war in Afghanistan, or is it crime prevention efforts within the U.S., depending on where the event occurs? Some in our community have also used this as a differentiation between Homeland Security and Homeland Defense. Let's consider some examples that reflect this foreign-domestic divide. The Lackawanna Six, also called the Buffalo Six, 4 of the individuals were born in the U.S. and were U.S. citizens, who were born overseas, and one of those was a naturalized citizen. Note that one of these individuals was later killed in Yemen in a Predator attack, a Predator controlled by the U.S. military, and he was one of the U.S.-born citizens. An anonymous note revealed their activities. They were tracked first by local authorities, but later by the FBI. Army Major Nidal Hassan, his attacks occurred domestically in a local community, but on an installation owned by the federal government. Additionally, he was inspired by Anwar al-Awlaki, a clear foreign nexus, even though al-Awlaki is a U.S. citizen. In the case of Farouk Abdul-Matulab, the Detroit-bound aircraft bomber or Christmas Day bomber, the National Counterterrorism Center, or NCTC, and the CIA share joint analytic responsibility for counterterrorism. The potential terrorist was placed on the Terrorist Identities Data Mart environment, or TIDE, because of his father expressing worry about him to the U.S. Embassy. There is a separate terrorist watch list, but he wasn't put on that. The NCTC does give TIDE data to the FBI's Terrorist Screening Center, or TSC. They then share with organizations that have a screening mission and put names on the no-fly list, which would have kept him off the plane. The bottom line is that the data was there, but analytic tools were not all used, and interdisciplinary crossover did not occur as it should have. Now, some other things to consider in this regard. The Patriot Act lists groups prohibited in the U.S., but how to apply laws to them is difficult. We cannot completely separate foreign and domestic operations in today's globalized world. Whether we are doing Homeland Security or Homeland Defense can result in changes in how the military operates, the loss of some individual rights to privacy by U.S. citizens, and a changing role for intelligence and law enforcement agencies. Consider also changes to our counterterrorism organizations following 9/11. For example, the FBI was a reactive, primarily law enforcement entity that could not pursue a domestic lead overseas, and the fact that a city police department, the NYPD, has officers assigned overseas to serve its counterterrorism interests. Al-Qaeda certainly represents a transnational security threat as a group of terrorist criminals who would pose a conventional military threat when supported by hostile nation states, or an asymmetric threat when operating independently but on foreign soil. The domestic versus international split creates an artificial divide between intelligence and response capabilities, thus hampering cooperation. Finally, keep in mind that the domestic-international divide was more responsible for missing the clues that preceded the attacks on 9/11. To confuse the matter even further regarding Homeland Security versus Homeland Defense after 9/11, a new military command was created, United States Northern Command. It has been a struggle to understand their role and to take into account how they can legally support domestic Homeland Security efforts in light of the many laws that prohibit their use, such as the Posse Comitatus Act, which disallows use for law enforcement activities. Nevertheless, the Department of Defense is the largest federal department and has the greatest resources in terms of personnel and capabilities found nowhere else. Not using them for the full range of all hazards Homeland Security activities does not make any sense. It has also led to debate of whether they should have a greater role, particularly in support of natural disasters. Military force throughout most of our history has been a blunt political instrument with profound political consequences when used. Whether used domestically or overseas, there are many considerations. For example, legal issues, particularly the constitutionality of using it to support law enforcement. The principle of proportionality, which can result in too many civilian casualties or real or perceived loss of civilian and civil liberties. The political effects are often unpredictable and can sometimes gain sympathy for terrorists and their organizations. Their use can result in violation of international laws or norms. They can risk offending allies, and DoD support to Homeland Security is global in nature and is often conducted in depth beginning at the source of the threat. Now, what military roles are most often included are using them for intelligence to include early warning and situational awareness, deterrence to include the ability to preempt, retaliate, and be ready for attack. In terms of domestic response, it has tremendous logistics capability, communications, transportation, and large numbers of people, and particular expertise in force protection, defense critical infrastructure protection, and information operations. Military officers understand that the primary role of the Department of Defense is Homeland Defense and to take the fight overseas. The secondary mission of Northern Command, defense support of civil authorities, is important but clearly secondary. Finally, our history and laws ensure that regardless of the scope of an event, the military will never be in charge of a domestic event. This is contrary to what our forefathers had in mind, and the public is not ready to have military forces walking the streets. This is a challenging concept for the military. To complicate matters yet further is the differences of roles between Title X or active duty military forces versus the role of the National Guard. The National Guard has a long history of support to both local efforts and certainly those that rise to the state level since they are owned by the governors. Some key facts about the National Guard. The Revolutionary War showed the militia had limited value against regular armies. In fact, we were lucky to win that war. The framers of the Constitution realized this and established specific and distinct roles for the militia. The Militia Act of 1791 mandated universal obligatory service at the state level with the state governor in command, but the forces available to the federal government are there when needed. The role of the National Guard in support of federal missions has elevated tremendously in the past decade, often leaving governors with a sense of vulnerability for supporting state-level natural disasters. An example of dysfunction occurred in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. A total of just over 70,000 military personnel supported response and recovery efforts in Louisiana, with about 53,000 of those belonging to various state National Guard units. The senior officer in the area, however, was Lieutenant General Russell Honore, who was on Title X active duty, and he technically had no authority over the National Guard forces. He reported to the President, while the Louisiana Adjutant General, a National Guard Major General, reported to the Governor. Command and control was inefficient at best. In 2009, as an indirect result of the inefficiencies that occurred during the hurricane, the concept of a dual status commander was developed. Select military officers, both on the active duty and on the National Guard side, are designated as dual hat commanders. They have command authority over all military forces and report to both the President and the Governor. The sheer number of organizations involved in all phases of Homeland Security summarizes the coordination issue. According to James Carafano of the Heritage Foundation, there are no good operational models on how to undertake major interagency activities outside of Washington. The most common is the lead agency model, in which one federal agency is responsible for leading a response or planning effort. Where the lead agency has the preponderance of responsibility and the resources, usually other departments act like bystanders, and often they have no incentive in doing more than is necessary. Where the departments all have major equities in the process, usually everyone simply agrees to do what they are already doing. Other organizational analysts have commented that in both the private sector, as well as at the federal, state, and local levels of government, that deeply entrenched cultural divisions are rooted in the organization manual, meaning the rules and regulations that guide organizational activity. In other words, the manual rarely, if at all, places value on working beyond the organizational walls. The manual cites core competencies of an organization, but it does not often explain how they can be shared or should be encouraged, for that matter, between and leveraged within multiple disciplines. Therefore, the manual compartmentalizes context from the start, not even giving collaboration a chance to succeed. This chart reflects the entities that the Montana Emergency Management Agency has to coordinate with. It is a relatively small organization, and obviously maintaining any kind of relationship with this many partner organizations is a monumental challenge. Interdisciplinary and interagency issues are well documented, and examples can no doubt be found in virtually every organization involved in the Homeland Security enterprise. Grasping the scope of the problem may be best accomplished by also describing a sampling of IQ at the tactical and operational levels. At the tactical level, the rivalry between firefighters and the law enforcement community is well known. McGeary, in a 2007 article, contends that interagency conflict between police and fire departments throughout the country has existed for many years and is generally attributable to competition for limited municipal dollars and the overlapping areas of responsibility. He cites the ongoing conflict between the New York City Police Department and the Fire Department of New York as being particularly egregious. While the traditional fire/police tensions are in place, he contends that missions are generally accomplished, but delays sometimes occur and resources are sometimes wasted. Here are yet more examples of IQ at the functional level. Carafano believes that it is at the intermediate or operational level where the U.S. government undertakes major operations and campaigns, and where agencies in Washington have to develop operational plans such as coordinating recovery operations after a major hurricane. This is where interagency cooperation is the weakest, and it is likely a legacy of the Cold War. Perhaps the least understood element of collaboration and greatest contributor to conflict is the human element. The struggle for any organization is not information technology or knowledge management capabilities, but the identification and understanding of the human element in order to effectively apply them. Many of the examples on these pages boil down to the human element. Collaboration occurs when people from different organizations or units within one organization produce something together through joint efforts, resources, and decision-making, and share ownership of the final product or service. People often rise above their self-interest and cooperate to achieve a common goal. Experts, practitioners, and after-action reports and Homeland Security leaders consistently cite 4 areas to address that can help minimize these issues: education, relationships, cooperation, and leadership. Each of these will be discussed, and note that leadership plays the biggest role. Education and training are key, as people and organizations often don't know enough about each other, nor do they necessarily know what makes for good collaboration. Courses that help officers build collaborative teams and utilize collaboration tools more effectively, and that focus on explaining the values of collaboration as well, are best. Joint training also gives participants valuable time together to work if they share the same assumptions, use the same definitions, and are working from the same perspective. Even more important, the teams will be operating in an environment where they can quickly identify points of disagreement and explore the reasons why. Building teams, building networks, developing realistic metrics and expectations through common understanding, establishing a common lexicon, and sensitizing students to the various cultures they have to work with before working together pays long-term dividends. Many basic training academies, such as those for police and fire services, have added blocks of instruction to their programs to provide a view into the processes and organizational cultures of their counterparts. A good example is the NYPD, which allocates time in their academy training programs to both fire and emergency medical services operations. Virtual, sandtable, and live exercises are also valuable in that they serve to build relationships and illustrate the high potential for miscommunication when interacting in a disaster environment. Practice preempts exchanging business cards at the scene of an event. Training and education should occur at every level from operators through senior executives. Senior managers will have already established a network of contacts with colleagues in other agencies that might come in handy as their subordinates begin to reach out to those organizations. Getting to know interdisciplinary or interagency partners on a personal level is another important element in working together cooperatively. It is natural for us to see the world through our own filters or beliefs, expectations, and experiences. Understanding and acknowledging our filters is a huge step towards being able to work with other cultures. Such understanding comes from building deeper relationships. Such relationships come from establishing social networks. For example, experienced intelligence analysts have always had their own networks of experts in their field or related fields with whom they can consult from time to time and whom they may recruit to work on a specific analytic project. Their relationships are built on trust, which is often developed from regular visits that strengthen professional and social ties. These ties can and should occur at all levels of an organization. While leadership is a necessity that can help break any obstacles, interdisciplinary cooperation must be a requirement, if not a more important one for that matter, at lower levels of organizations in order to facilitate a beneficial outcome for all involved. This does not solely require a deeper understanding of the culture. That is only one step in the process. It also requires a deeper understanding of the commonalities between the cultures. We need to get past fear of reaching outside of our respective organizations, most notably during non-emergency moments, so that the natural instinct of the future is to support one another rather than withdraw into the silos created by the existing and obviously outdated administrative structures. The response to the 9/11 attacks on the Pentagon is a great example. The Arlington County Deputy Fire Chief, who was the incident commander at the scene of the attack, had developed close relationships with surrounding area fire departments, the Pentagon Police, and other agencies involved in the response. With key individuals knowing each other and having knowledge of their respective capabilities, the incident command was established quickly and efficiently. As with any relationship, regular visits are a necessity. There must be benefit for all parties involved, and they must be institutionalized, meaning that the relationship is not focused solely on any single individual, and that it won't end should that individual leave the organization. Also, attempt to define the specific issues or problems regarding working together, collaboration, that are under consideration, as well as the specific context within which they must occur. Chatting over a cup of coffee can pay tremendous benefits. Experience shows that organizations perform best when their collaboration and coordination is at the right level, adequate to support the mission, but not so much as to generate an unnecessary communication workload. Collaborative communities should be self-defining, self-creating, agile, and adaptive. The users should effectively own the environment. The principle simply acknowledges the complexity of the world in which the Homeland Security enterprise must function. Collaborative work practices save participants time over the long run, increase their impact, and enhance their careers. The most important and often overlooked incentive for collaborating is the psychological reward from solving a hard problem, improving mission capability, or saving time. Effective collaboration at the start almost always leads to faster coordination at the end. As discussed above, and according to David Noble, devoting efforts towards task work, or the work to be accomplished at hand, and teamwork, which focuses specifically on the collaborative relationship, can achieve better results. Current approaches, and particularly the federal effort called whole government, focuses on integrating efforts and responsibilities across organizations at the operational and strategic levels. Noble has developed a model which incorporates all of the concepts discussed thus far. The model stresses ensuring the tools and capabilities exist to enable cooperation. Once they are in place, improved understanding, whether it derives from education, relationships, or focused cooperation, lead to enhanced collaboration, more flexibility in command and control, and overall improved interdisciplinary effectiveness. Leadership is, in my opinion, the most significant requirement of interdisciplinary effectiveness and successful collaboration. Leaders who seek to understand other disciplines and who are committed personally and professionally to collaboration to achieve mission goals are the ones who ensure that personnel within their individual disciplines do the same. Leadership can address numerous issues. For example, incentives can clearly reflect that leaders appreciate and reward good collaboration. A common assumption is that more collaboration is always better than less, which is not always the case. It should be readily apparent to anyone who has participated in any group or organized endeavor that increasing the increment of collaboration does not necessarily lead to any sort of recognizable group or organizational improvement. Collaboration will certainly lead to various outcomes, but increased performance may not be one of them. Leaders who attribute all sorts of benefits to collaboration may fail to understand the complex set of causal factors that lead to performance. Misdiagnosis of organizational problems is common. Collaboration may in fact lead to a host of unpleasant or unwanted outcomes, such as information overload, confusion, increased conflict, and decreased performance. Leadership needs to reinforce the case for positive collaboration by giving credit when evaluating their personnel. Diplomacy is the ability to confront issues directly without threatening other members of the collaboration. It's a skill that leaders should have and should exemplify to their subordinates. Leaders who are poor partners themselves do nothing to inspire collaboration in their organizations. Without powerful examples at the top, collaborations that begin as a merger of equals can easily degenerate into conflicts that distract both sides from the business at hand. A top-down strategy sends a strong signal out to the workforce that this cooperation is important. Engaged leaders send a powerful message to the workforce when they integrate collaborative practices into their daily work practices and those of their staff. This validates the message that collaboration is not only a preferred mode of conducting business, but it is the most effective way to do so. Winston Churchill showed that a strong-willed leader who bows to external pressures can be detrimental. He used ethical decision-making, which is a cornerstone of true leadership. Churchill was able to apply his previous knowledge and experience to prepare and sustain his nation during a brutal war. These kinds of ethically based leadership decisions face public leaders daily, but are emphasized during a crisis. Their decisions have a direct impact on potentially life-saving planning and response. Given the devastating social and economic ramifications of a terrorist attack or natural disasters, leaders must each weigh every consideration before settling on a final path. In the Homeland Security enterprise, that path generally includes collaboration, and a good leader must lead by example. In summary, interagency coordination is an inherently unnatural act. We as a culture and our government are of the people, and we are traditionally individualistic. More layers have the chance of increasing message distortion and increasing individualistic tendencies. The 9/11 Commission, when looking at interagency cooperation issues, concluded that the problem is nearly intractable because of the way the government is currently structured. It is hard to break down stovepipes when there are so many stoves that are legally and politically entitled to have cast iron pipes of their own. Our systems and our bureaucracies do not necessarily foster cooperation. In most cases, personnel are not rewarded and promoted based on their successes in collaborative processes. In some cases, in fact, such as in the intelligence community, rewards and punishments were geared towards enhancing the operations and funding of individual agencies and essentially discouraging collaboration. The challenge for us is to find and recognize those strengths in one another and exploit them to the fullest. A concentrated effort to understand cultural differences across the multitude of agencies and to develop a common lexicon and transparent rules of engagement can reduce misunderstanding and will allow us to see how those differences can improve the effectiveness of our community. Given the wide variety of organizational cultures, the chances for miscommunication abound. Anecdotal evidence from those who have spent decades working with interagency teams and task forces suggests that the amount of miscommunication that occurs in such settings is consistently underestimated. By focusing not just on the tasks to be accomplished, but also on the quality of the collaboration and interactions, great gains can be made in how we handle prevention, response, and recovery when needed. Thank you for listening to the webinar. Please do take a few minutes to tell us what you think of this webinar, and please complete our survey that's at the following address. Now, in addition, you may send any questions that you have about this topic and webinar to the email address that's posted on this slide.